The Americas under the magnifying glass. What would we find if, for a moment, we looked at the Americas beyond their current governments, beyond their presidents, beyond their political parties, beyond left and right, beyond electoral disputes, and even beyond the news stories that dominate today's headlines? Stories we will likely barely remember a few years from now. What would we find? We would find something far more enduring. The countries, their peoples, their histories, their institutions, and some extraordinary documents that seek to establish the fundamental rules of how they coexist. Their constitutions. That was when we at the Thought Laboratory decided to conduct an experiment. We turned to the constitutions of the 35 independent states of the Americas, one by one, and we began to search. We didn't know exactly what we would find, but we had a question. Are there fundamental principles that, even if phrased differently, recur throughout the constitutions of the Americas? We set out to find them, and yes, we found them. I am Carlos Alberto, the thinker. Welcome to the journey. 35 independent states, over 1 billion people, presidential republics, parliamentary systems, constitutional monarchies, vast countries and small island nations, different languages, different cultures, different histories, different economic models, and different ways of organizing power. At first glance, such diversity might seem to make finding a common denominator difficult. But our question wasn't whether the Americas were all the same. Clearly, they are not. The question was far more interesting. Can deeply different societies agree on certain fundamental principles? To answer that, we needed to establish a rule. We wouldn't look for identical words, we would look for principles, because two constitutions might use different expressions to protect similar values, and two constitutions can also use the same word while assigning it different institutional meanings. That is why, from the outset, we distinguish between literal coincidence and conceptual equivalence, and we begin with one of the most important principles, sovereignty. In numerous constitutions across the Americas, we find an idea expressed with particular clarity. Power derives its legitimacy from the people or the nation. Mexico affirms that national sovereignty resides essentially and originally in the people. El Salvador declares that sovereignty resides in the people. Uruguay builds its own framework around the sovereignty of the nation and its exercise by the citizens. Other countries use similar formulas. But then we come to Canada and several Caribbean nations, and there we encounter a different constitutional tradition. Constitutional monarchies, parliaments, representative governments, elections, institutional accountability, not necessarily the same words, not necessarily the same framework, but principles of legitimacy and representation expressed through different mechanisms. And our first lesson emerged. If we wanted to discover where the Americas might find common ground, we could not demand that they be identical. Commonality does not mean uniformity. We continued. We looked for liberty, and we found it. Personal liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, freedom of movement, not always phrased in the exact same way, not always with the exact same scope, but present within the constitutionalism of the Americas. Then we looked for equality, and it too appeared. Equality before the law, equal legal protection, prohibitions against discrimination, guarantees designed to protect the individual against arbitrary action. We looked for dignity, we looked for rights, we looked for representation, we looked for institutions, and slowly our table began to fill with points of convergence. Sovereignty, liberty, equality, dignity, rights, representation, institutions. Then we enter much more complex territory, the organization of power. Do the 35 American states establish an identical separation of powers. No, and to say so would be incorrect. Presidential republics organize power in one way. Parliamentary systems do so in another. Caribbean constitutional monarchies have their own tradition. There are also systems with fundamentally different institutional designs. But beneath those differences, we find a principle once again. Power requires rules. There are bodies. There are competencies. There are procedures. There are institutions designed to legislate, govern, and adjudicate. The architecture changes. The principle remains recognizable. The exercise of power requires institutional organization. And here we encounter an idea we know well. Institutions regulate the exercise of power. Virtue guides its exercise. Then we turn to the economy. And here the differences were even greater. There is no single constitutional economic model in the Americas. Some constitutions grant special protection to private property and economic initiative. Others emphasize the social function of property. Others recognize different forms of property. Labor, too, is protected through various approaches. But again, we find recurring elements: property, labor, economic activity, protection of assets, labor rights, initiative. We do not find a single American economic model. We find different ways of constitutionally organizing activities fundamental to the economic life of the peoples. And then something began to emerge that we had not expected to find with such clarity. Not an American constitution, not an American ideology, not an American political system. Something different, a territory of shared principles. But then a problem arose, the case of Cuba. And Cuba forced us to hold the experiment, because when we examine its current constitution, we find something particularly interesting. There too appear words and principles we had encountered in other constitutions: popular sovereignty, dignity, equality, certain rights. But at the same time, we find a profoundly different political architecture. The current Cuban constitution constitutionally establishes the leading role of a single party. Then an uncomfortable question arose. Could we consider two principles equivalent simply because they were written in a similar way? The answer was no. But immediately another even more important question arose. Could we judge a people's entire tradition of principles based solely on the constitution in force at a specific historical moment? Again, the answer was no. And Cuba provided us with an extraordinary example. Before the current 2019 Constitution, there was the Socialist Constitution of 1976. Before that, the Revolutionary Fundamental Law of 1959. Before that came the coup d'etat of 1952, and prior to that rupture, there was the Cuban Constitution of 1940, a constitution born of a pluralistic constituent assembly, belonging to a completely different era of Cuban political history. So, we laid the dates out on the table: 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, and we realized something. A constitution is also a snapshot of a historical moment. But a country's tradition of principles is a movie, and if we truly wanted to understand the Americas, we couldn't just look at snapshots. We had to watch the movie. At this point, our experiment had to correct itself, and I want to dwell on this point because it is fundamental. We could have made a very convenient mistake. Using the current constitution when it aligned with our hypothesis, and looking for an earlier constitution when the current one didn't suit us. That would have destroyed the entire research project, because anyone could have rightly asked us, are you choosing the constitution you need to prove what you had already decided to prove? That is why we established another rule, the same rule for everyone. We would not choose a convenient constitution. we would observe each country's own tradition of principles. Cuba has its own. Uruguay has its own. Brazil has its own. Mexico has its own. The United States has its own. Canada has its own. Haiti has its own. Every nation in the Americas possesses a constitutional trajectory born of its own history. Some have extraordinary continuity. Others went through coups d'etat, revolutions, civil wars, dictatorships, democratic restorations, reforms, new constitutions. Consequently, our question evolved. We had already identified shared principles in current constitutions. Now, we needed to know something more. Do those principles belong solely to the texts currently in force? Or do they form part, amidst advances, setbacks, interruptions, and recoveries, of the various constitutional traditions of the Americas? And here, a fundamental distinction arises. Each country has its own tradition. We are not looking for a single constitutional history of the Americas. It does not exist. We are looking for something different. 35 traditions, 35 historical paths, and the question, at how many points do those paths converge? A principle might appear for decades. Then it might vanish during an institutional rupture. And then we return to it. Perhaps another had been incorporated much more recently. Perhaps some principles remained almost unchanged. And perhaps others had never been part of certain national traditions. All of that matters, because our goal is not to prove a theory, it is to understand a reality. And so, the exception ceased to be a problem. It became a tool. Cuba did not necessarily destroy the pattern. It was teaching us to observe it better. The constitutions had allowed us to find common ground. The exception forced us to look at its history, and our research had just become much deeper. But something was still missing, because among the principles we had decided to look for, there were some that did not appear with the same clarity in all national constitutions: international cooperation, non-intervention, peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for the sovereignty of other states. So, we opened another document, the Charter of the Organization of American States, and we found a second dimension, because the 35 independent states of the Americas are part of the inter-American system built around that charter. Principles related to state sovereignty, independence, cooperation, non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes appear there. And we found a particularly interesting idea. Cooperation among American states does not necessarily require them to have identical political, economic, and social systems. Once again, the same principle we had discovered by comparing constitutions appeared. Difference does not necessarily mean incompatibility. So, we laid all the documents out on the table again. On one side, the constitutions, behind them, the different national constitutional traditions, and on another level, the inter-American commitments that seek to organize coexistence among sovereign states. And that was where our initial question began to transform. We had asked, are there shared principles among the constitutions of the Americas? We went looking for them. And yes, we found them, with variations, with differences, with exceptions, with varying degrees of historical depth. But we found them. And then a question arose that we hadn't anticipated when we began our experiment. If such diverse societies have come to recognize similar principles, if different constitutional traditions converge at certain points, if there are also inter-American commitments aimed at protecting sovereignty, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence, what does all this mean? Are we simply looking at a legal curiosity, or are we observing the scattered foundations of something we have not yet learned how to build? That was when a phrase appeared on our workbench. The Great Shield of the Americas. But we must be extremely careful. We do not yet know if it can be built, and we certainly do not know how. We are not proposing a continental government. We are not proposing the elimination of borders. We are not proposing that 35 different peoples think alike. Nor are we necessarily talking about a military alliance. We are formulating a hypothesis, nothing more. Could those principles, upon which the various American traditions have found common ground, one day become the basis for a cooperative architecture designed to protect what those peoples consider fundamental, their sovereignty, their freedom, their institutions, their capacity to prosper, their right to choose their own path, their security, and peace among them? We do not know, and that is precisely why we must continue our research. Because finding foundations does not mean proving that a building can be erected upon them. An idea might seem extraordinary, yet be impossible. It might seem just, yet produce unjust consequences. It might promise cooperation, yet end up creating domination. It might speak of sovereignty, yet end up weakening it. That is why the laboratory's next step will not be to defend the Great Shield. It will be to do exactly the opposite. We will attempt to dismantle our own hypothesis. We will ask who might be part of it. Which principles would truly be shared? What would happen regarding political differences? How it could protect sovereignty without becoming a power that stands above the states? How to prevent it from becoming an ideological bloc? How to prevent it from ending up directed against another region of the world? And above all, what purpose it would serve? Because there is a question that no political architecture can avoid. Would it truly improve people's lives? If the answer were no, then we do not need to build it. But if our hypothesis manages to survive those questions, then perhaps we need to ask one last one. Does the Great Shield of the Americas need to be invented from scratch? Or have some of its foundations been right in front of us all along, waiting for us to learn to recognize them? And now, I want to ask something of you. Something especially important. Don't just listen to this investigation. Take part in it. Leave us your opinion. Ask a question. Point out a contradiction. Tell us which principle you consider fundamental. Tell us what we're seeing correctly and also what we might be getting wrong. Because a question can open a path we haven't discovered yet. An objection can force us to rethink an idea. And a different opinion can help us better understand what we are investigating. That is what the Thought Laboratory is all about. Thinking together doesn't mean thinking alike. It means helping each other think better. That's why your comments matter. And they also do something very simple yet fundamental. They help this work reach other people who might also have something to contribute. If you think this investigation is worth continuing, please subscribe to the channel, share this video, and join the conversation in the comments. Every new person who joins expands our dialogue, and every good question can improve the next chapter. Because the Great Shield of the Americas, if we ever prove it can be built, cannot simply originate from our own drawing board. First, it must survive the questions, doubts, and ideas of the people who make up these Americas. In the next chapter, we'll do exactly that. We'll try to put our own hypothesis to the test. We'll look for its weak points, its contradictions, its risks, and we'll see if it manages to stand tall. I'm Carlos Alberto, the Thinker. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Subscribe, share, ask, share your thoughts, and above all, keep thinking with us. Because thinking well means living better. See you in the next chapter. The journey continues.